Here we are this morning in this odd twist in the church calendar. We're marking the fourth Sunday of Advent, just hours before this place will be overflowing with people gathered to celebrate Christmas Eve. So thank you for being part of the faithful gathered to see Advent through to its completion on behalf of our whole community. Now, in another slight wrinkle in liturgical time, the scripture we hear this morning is one that we'd normally hear on the Feast of the Annunciation, which is usually celebrated on March 25th. But before we fast forward 9 months to the birth of Jesus, let's pause and listen for how this story might speak to us in a new way this morning. The scripture we just heard is from the First Nations version of the New Testament. One of the things I find most remarkable about this translation is its rendering of people's names. Did you catch Gabriel is called Creator's Mighty One? Jesus is called Creator Sets Free. And Mary is named Bitter Tears, Bitter Tears. I find it kind of a startling image. After all, later on today, our children will bring this story to life with a smiling, poised 8-year-old girl playing Mary and a slightly older angel Gabriel delivering this impossible mission to her. I imagine there will be surprise, then cheer, but probably not bitter tears. Let's listen again. Creator's Mighty One, Gabriel, said to Bitter Tears, Mary, "Greetings, highly favored one. You are close to the Great Spirit and greatly honored among women." Bitter Tears, Mary, was deeply troubled by this greeting. In reality, the gospel tells us that this unsuspecting young woman is deeply troubled by this startling encounter. I can only imagine the mix of confusion, fear, excitement, and wonder that might have arisen for her at that moment. We hear at other points in Luke's storytelling that even as a very young woman, Mary would have glimpses of the enormity of her task. In chapter 2, Luke tells us that when the shepherds arrived in Bethlehem and relayed what the angels had told them about the baby, Mary pondered these words in her heart. And later in that same chapter, that Simeon said to Mary, this child is destined for the falling and the rising of many, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Naming Mary Bitter Tears calls our attention to the reality that right from the start of the Jesus story, sorrow and joy will be bound up together. From before his birth through his public ministry with hurting people, to his own suffering and death, and right through to his resurrection. We call this the Paschal mystery, the paradox at the heart of our Christian faith. Mystery. We heard this in the angel's words to Mary. "Do not fear," he comforted her, "for you have found goodwill in the eyes of the great mystery." What could that mean, to find goodwill in the eyes of the great mystery? I've been reading a book by Susan Cain called Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. It's an exploration of the reality that most of us have encountered in some form, that sorrow and joy are, in fact, intertwined in a great mystery. We often wish it weren't so. But most of us have, over the course of our lifetime, probably experienced our share of disappointment, heartbreak, and grief. The uncomfortable truths that love is, at times, fleeting, change is constant, and life is far more finite and precious than we imagine it to be. Our modern Western culture might have us avoid, deny, gloss over, or just delete these uncomfortable realities. But Susan Cain wants us to take a closer look. Bittersweet. What does she mean by bittersweet? A tendency toward longing, poignancy, and sorrow. An acute awareness of passing time. A curiously piercing joy at the beauty of the world. The recognition that light and dark, birth and death are forever paired. Now, she proposes that bittersweetness is not something to be avoided, but rather embraced as a way of being in the world, a way that teaches us to acknowledge pain and to seek its transformation through acts of creativity and compassion and solidarity. One idea that fascinated her and that drove her research was the Buddhist notion that we should strive to participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world, to participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world. But, she wondered, what could this look like? I wonder if it might look like the encounter in today's gospel, as bitter tears, Mary, who has found favor in the great mystery, Mary summons forth the bravery and the boldness to respond to the angel, "Let it be as you have said." I have always admired Mary for the courage to say this, but I have also wondered what exactly it looked like in practice as her statement would become her reality. I think I got a glimpse of this earlier this week at L'Arche, where we held our Christmas in the Barn celebration. This was something we'd started during the pandemic, and now, even though we're back to gathering indoors, people still wanted to have Christmas in the barn. So there we were, people with and without disabilities, everybody bundled up in coats and hats and mitts, over which we added a layer of costumes, white robes and wings and tinsel for angels, blankets and ponchos and walking sticks for shepherds. Now, this creative endeavor is neither fancy nor polished, but we do it because we found that the best way to tell a story is to tell it together. When we say the familiar words and move through the motions and sing and dance, we find that the story comes alive in a new way that surprises and delights us. I want to tell you about the young woman who played the role of Mary. A recent high school graduate, she's petite in stature, with sparkling eyes and a wide grin. I would imagine that over the course of her young life, she has encountered more than her fair share of physical aches and pains due to her disability, as well as the pain of being left out or overlooked. When she speaks, you need to listen carefully to make out the exact words that she's saying. But you don't have to worry about volume because she has a booming, enthusiastic voice. She's very determined. So having arrived early for the rehearsal and claimed the role of Mary for herself, she then sat at the door and kept watch for her good friend whom she'd picked to play the part of Joseph. And when he moseyed in the door a little later, she ran right up to him and announced, "I'm Mary, and you're Joseph, and we're going to have a baby." Now, a kind and gentle soul, he knew well enough just to go along with her plan, and so he did, shrugging and smiling and following along as she confidently steered him wherever he needed to be. Here are two qualities that struck me about her embodiment of Mary. First, gratitude. We've been talking a lot about gratitude in our community this year, so she worked this into her portrayal. She thanked the angel Gabriel for visiting. She thanked her cousin Elizabeth for encouraging her. And perhaps most notably, she thanked each of the 3 innkeepers that they approached for a room, not just the third one who finally let them use the stable, but also the first 2 who turned them away. Gratitude. The second thing that struck me about her portrayal of Mary was her joy. Once Mary and Joseph had finally arrived at the stable, someone handed them a doll wrapped in a huge white sheet that was really much too big for this job. But Mary worked out all the swaddling, and she proudly placed the swaddled baby in an improvised manger. And then she and Joseph finally got to have a seat on 2 plastic chairs with the manger between them. When we got to the end of the story, the shepherds headed back to their fields praising God, and everyone broke into singing, "Go Tell It on the Mountain." And eager to warm up in that cold barn, the crowd leapt to their feet and began to dance. All except for Mary, which is unusual for someone who's usually at the front of the line for everything. So I went over to her to help her up, but she hesitated, and she looked down at the baby in the manger as if to ask, could she abandon her post? So together we picked up the baby Jesus and re-swaddled him, and then she proudly tucked him into her arms and headed into the crowd to dance. And the crowd just closed in around her, and they took turns dancing with the baby Jesus too. Gratitude and joy. As we draw near to Christmas and all the bittersweetness it may hold for us, may we be blessed with gratitude for all that is, and joy to hold Jesus at the heart of our celebrations. For we are close to the Great Spirit, and we have found goodwill in the eyes of the great mystery.